we grew right after and have continued to in that regard. So I think for churches to see, other groups to see that that can happen was helpful. Clearly, it was very helpful for LGBT people in the community. I mean, to have a church very, very publicly say that you're welcome, and that from our perspective, what the church has done and continues to do in terms of giving theological underpinning for discrimination is really wrong. And so that was really helpful to a number of people, and it was again part of that wave of change. The genie was just squirming out of the bottle at that point. And hopefully that helped the genie get out a little bit more, because there's no putting it back now, and that's important.
Yeah. Well, maybe shift gears a little bit, talk a little about stuff on sort of the political realm. You were involved in the mid-'90s with getting an ordinance passed, an anti-discrimination ordinance passed in Grand Rapids. That was quite a battle. I remember going to the public hearings of that, and it was pretty contentious. So I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that experience, what level of organizing you were involved with that, and just sort of your sense of how the larger Grand Rapids community grappled with that issue.
Mm-hmm. It's a little bit foggy in my memory, because you get only a few years ago, but you just move on. That's sort of never taken care of, because you always have to keep an eye on it, because people always want to pull back, and there's some episodes of that trying to happen in Grand Rapids as well. But I wasn't, to my memory, I wasn't one of the major organizers of that. The big push came, of course, from George Hartwell. I mean, George really gets a lot of credit for doing that, and so allies from lots of realms came, and so I was clearly involved with helping people know what was going on, getting people to meetings, speaking with commissioners, doing all those kinds of things, because that really was that was an interesting effort. I think it was already at the point, though. Grand Rapids had done some pretty progressive things earlier. One of the major things that I was involved with was getting the city to divest some of its funds from South Africa, and I think those can be building blocks. I think they saw that they could take a stance as a city and they wouldn't fall apart, and it was important to stand with. I mean, this was a anti-discrimination issue. But I think some of those things may have been building blocks, and they saw, we can take these stances as a city. It's within our realm, and especially with the LGBT thing, the anti-discrimination. I mean, again, a number of gay folks had been, worked very hard and been very clear about, what's happening to them in housing, public accommodation, and so forth. And so there was, a lot of sensitivity and a lot of courage on the part of, city commissioners. And, I think we were just trying to help that be heard.
You had mentioned to me earlier when we were talking that there was, at least there was an attempt that never never came to fruition, but an attempt amongst some folks, particularly from like the Michigan Family Forum, to maybe try to fight that, to reverse or repeal that decision by the city of Grand Rapids, which certainly speaks to the issue that there are folks, for lack of a better term, on the right that have been very vocal, as you said earlier, in sort of fighting these kinds of struggles, and they have been very, very vocal, and some of them also have deep pockets to kind of fund campaigns both in state and out of state around that. I'm just wondering what experience you've had or your own observations about those organizations and individuals in terms of the influence they've had, and how much has that you had to sort of factor into the kind of work that you do in terms of organizing for more equality here.
Well, they've had the clearest place you can see where they had influence was in passing Proposal 2. which declared in the Constitution of Michigan marriage between one man and one woman. That they funded that. They had their people, and that was, their influence was huge in that, and mostly from funding, and from funding that much of it came from out of state. And I think they feel threatened, perhaps, and so anytime a group feels threatened, they're apt to really dig in their heels or whatever. So they had a big influence there. And I think probably that's one of the main reasons it passed, because they had their people out. But mostly the funding. Now they've tried a number of other things that there was a group that came there. There was a threat, a person locally who was bringing them in and trying to deal with. I believe it was specifically the ordinance, and a group of us got together upon hearing about that, and were organized right from the get-go, and broad-based organization that we met at the church I pastor, and they decided not to follow through with it. So sometimes, organizing and being on the ground and ready can prevent something like that from even, becoming a threat. But it's a continual threat. I mean, because sentiment may be very much in favor of any group, or in this case, of rights to LGBT people. But, if you're not out voting, if you're not putting your money there, if you're not, talking to folks, sentiment doesn't vote. Obviously, it's very important how we treat other people, but if discriminatory groups are using, the state legislature or the legal process and so forth, we have to do the same, or we have to be very clear about that threat, because it doesn't take a majority. It takes some active people who get their people out, and I think we don't pay enough attention to, getting people out, countering those threats, and realizing that all it takes is a well-funded organization with people single-minded enough to push their agenda through, and it'll happen. So, it's tough. I mean, there are a lot of important issues. I mean, sometimes I feel like much of what I care about is under siege, and I can very much understand people's weariness in that regard. But I think we do need to keep our eyes open, and we need to realize that these are issues because they involve people's lives, and they continue to involve people's lives, especially young people's lives, and their perspective on themselves, and whether life is worth living and so forth. So, that's the kind of thing that helps keep me motivated, and just the people, the gay and lesbian and transgender folks that I know, that are friends of mine, that are part of the congregation. Really, their stories, but also their perseverance and triumphs have really enriched our congregation as well.
You mentioned earlier that the AIDS epidemic, in many ways, was a kind of a galvanizing force for organizing and activism in West Michigan. I'm just wondering what your sense is of being here and working on this issue for the last 30 years. Where does Grand Rapids fit in the sort of the national scene in that sense? Do you think that we're behind the curve? We're sort of more or less kind of the same place that much of the nation is? Are we ahead of the curve? I mean, how do you sort of measure where Grand Rapids or West Michigan is with the rest of the country?
It's hard to know. I mean, we probably, because we're so often a test market for products, we're probably about in the middle on this one, as well as a number of other things. We've done some progressive things, before a lot, like that ordinance. But also there are very, very vocal institutions and groups that really, denominationally and, in terms of colleges and so forth, that really in the community really struggle with this because of their their religious connections and so forth. And so, those factors may put us behind the acceptance and openness that is in, I think, through much more of the country. Obviously, there are pockets that are very, very open and progressive, and there are pockets that are less. But my guess is that we're probably a little bit less, because there has been a very strong social and church, underpinning, and there still is. There are issues that we deal with that some other people, from out state look at and say, why is that an issue? So in that sense, we can be a little behind, and I can be a little defensive because, we shouldn't be dealing with that, having to deal with that still. But the change is enormous in the community. Clearly from 12 years, 14, 15 years ago, it is simply not the big deal that it was. It's not to say it's not a big deal for some and for some institutions, and that there's still not real risk for gay and lesbian people in lots of quarters, but it's not nearly as widespread as it was. And in terms of church communities, there are a number of church communities that are, specifically on record, like we are, as by action of the congregation, or leadership of the congregation at least, open and affirming, or whatever denominational thing there is. But even in denominations that at their national level, are still against that and struggling there, even in Grand Rapids, there are churches of those denominations that are very open, and many, many people in those denominations that are really, pushing the denominational structure, their own churches, and are strong allies and are, organizing. So that's, you can't say that there aren't, that even denominationally that there are, that it's, groups that are completely against gay and lesbian folks. There's a much more openness to the struggle now, and in some ways where the pushback happens is even a bigger deal, because it is pushback and it's less acceptable than it was. So that will change. That will change too. And people are saying that we're not going to hell because we've been open to real people.
Right. Maybe last question, because this project is sort of modeled on the work that Howard Zinn did in his People's History of the United States, to try to capture history and voices that maybe is not included or has been suppressed or have been marginalized in some way. How important do you think it for people, people now, but also for future generations, to have a sense of how this sort of struggle has evolved? Do you think that that's crucial in terms of where people are at, in the present day, to have a sense of this history?
Clearly it is. My hope is that the day is soon where we can, I want to say, afford to forget. That we will, that folks, younger people coming up, or a couple generations, will be surprised that this was ever an issue. I guess that would be the best, but unfortunately there will probably for a long time be other justice issues where people need to organize and to be heard, and where they feel alone, and where they feel like the odds are completely against them. And I think, this struggle nationally and locally really will help folks whatever they're struggling against in terms of an organizing sort of thing, to say, wow, this was done in this situation, in this setting, against this issue. Maybe we can get courage, if not lessons, from that. And I think it's always important to honor the folks that were on the front lines, because they do change things for people. And I think, for folks, whoever it is down the road who feels discriminated against, to see that people who really were, who whose voices weren't listened to, gay and lesbian folks, spoke and made them, made themselves be heard, was really is really an important legacy. And so hopefully, I think this kind of project's really important for a number of reasons, but those being among them.
Great. Thanks for taking time to talk to us today, Doug.
My pleasure.
I have a question. But we're sort of overlapping with a project through Grand Valley that's trying to look at the history of the LGBT community and the history at Grand Valley. Do you have any connection or stories about that? Because, William James and Thomas Jefferson College were, in many cases, centers of activity, and even administratively were run by lesbian women, I know, at William James and TJC as well. So.
Yeah, I really don't have, I didn't have much connection with Grand Valley at that point. It was out there, it was out there a ways, and I'm sure that there were, involvements and connections, but I don't remember specifically, people at those colleges that I knew were specifically involved with, with these kinds of things.
Okay.
Yeah.